Evening, everyone. Let's have a drink. It's about that time, I think. It's late at night, about the weekend, and, well, it's a good time to sit and relax and pontificate, I suppose. Well, drink first, then pontificate. I brought some tea tonight. I've been on a tea fix lately. It's calming, it's relaxing, and hydrating too. So it's just good all around. Can't beat it. But feel free to drink what you want, whatever you want. I won't judge. Everybody has their own flavor, styles, tastes, so, far be it for me to not drink you're drinking. That would just be silly. So, cheers to you. And Jesus too. Well, speaking of pontificating, I brought something today that I think you all might find interesting. It's a little bit of history, and I know a lot of people find history boring. I've heard everything from dead people and dates. In 1862, blah blah blah. I get it, but a lot of stuff, when you look back at history, you can kind of see how it relates to today. Sometimes the things that happened in the past often look like what are happening now. Or a lot of times you can look at the past and see how we got here. Almost like a road map. So I find it interesting, and this particular story concerns us all, so I think you'll find it interesting too. I think it'll be worth your time. So, yeah, kick back, relax, enjoy your drink, and let me go through this. Brought my trusty notebook, all sorts of cool stuff in here. But today, I brought a cool story about the CIA and the media. Some people know this, some people don't. A while ago, back in the mid-20th century, I think starting in the 50s, 40s, 50s, probably 50s, there was a Operation Mockingbird, is what it was called. And it was basically a collusion between the CIA and the American media and foreign media to get together and spread propaganda. And it all got blown out of the water? What term am I looking for? It all got exposed. There we go. By this guy, Carl Bernstein. And there had been kind of drips and rumors here and there, but this guy really took it to the next level with his reporting. And it kind of shows. It's a very long report, but I've summarized it. I've marked all the key points, but I'm going to link the rest, the article and all the details in down below. So you can read the whole thing for yourself if you want, but like I said, I've covered all the juicy details. We'll go over those now. So, yeah. Here we go. I'll try and keep it quick. Let's see. After leaving the Washington Post in 1977, Carl Bernstein spent 6 months looking at the relationship of the CIA and the press during the Cold War. His 25,000-word cover story published in the Rolling Stone on October 20th, 1977, and is reprinted below. Here. The CIA and the media, how America's most powerful news media worked hand in glove with the Central Intelligence Agency, and why the Church Committee covered it up. Yeah. Juicy stuff. Alright, first thing. In 1953, Joseph Alsop, then one of America's leading syndicated columnists, went to the Philippines to cover an election. He did not go because he was asked to do so by his syndicate. He did not go because he was asked to do so by the newspapers that printed his column. He was sent at the request of the CIA. Alsop is one of more than 400 American journalists who in the past 25 years have secretly carried out assignments for the Central Intelligence Agency, according to documents on file at CIA headquarters. Some of these journalists' relationships with the agency were tacit, some were explicit. There was cooperation, accommodation, and overlap. Journalists provided a full range of clandestine services, from simple intelligence gathering to serving as go-betweens with spies in communist countries. Reporters shared their notebooks with the CIA. Editors shared their staffs. Some of the journalists were Pulitzer Prize winners, distinguished reporters who considered themselves ambassadors without portfolio for their country. Most were less exalted. Foreign correspondents who found that their association with the agency helped their work. Stringers and freelancers who were as interested in the derring-do of the spy business as in filing articles, and, the smallest category, full-time CIA employees masquerading as journalists abroad. In many instances, CIA documents show journalists were engaged to perform tasks for the CIA with the consent of the managements of America's leading news organizations. The history of the CIA's involvement with the American press continues to be shrouded by an official policy of obfuscation. It's late. I apologize. I'm going to botch some big words. I'm sorry. And deception for the following principal reasons. Shrouded by an official policy. Yes, okay. The use of journalists has been among the most productive means of intelligence gathering employed by the CIA. Although the agency has cut back sharply on the use of reporters since 1973, primarily as a result of the pressure from the media, some journalist operatives are still posted abroad. Further investigation into the matter, CIA officials say, would inevitably reveal a series of embarrassing relationships in the 1950s and 60s with some of the most powerful organizations and individuals in American journalism. Among the executives who lent their cooperation to the agency were William Willard, Mr. Paley, of the Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, Henry Luce of Time Inc., Arthur Hayes Sulzberger of the New York Times, Barry Bingham Sr. of the Louisville Courier-Journal, and James Copley of the Copley News Service. I haven't heard of Copley News, so I'm assuming they went out of business. Anyway, other organizations which cooperated with the CIA include the American Broadcasting Company, ABC, the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, the Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, Hearst Newspaper, Scripps Howard, Newsweek Magazine, the Mutual Broadcasting System, the Miami Herald, the Old Saturday Evening Post, and New York Herald Tribune. By far the most valuable of these associations, according to CIA officials, have been with the New York Times, CBS, and Time Incorporated. Yeah, page 2. The CIA's use of the American news media has been much more extensive than the agency officials have acknowledged publicly or in closed sessions with members of Congress. The general outlines of what happened are indisputable. The specifics are harder to come by. CIA sources hint that a particular journalist was trafficked all over Eastern Europe for the agency. The journalist says no, he just had lunch with the station chief. CIA sources say flatly that a well-known ABC correspondent worked for the agency through 1973. They refuse to identify him. A high-level CIA official with prodigious memory says that the New York Times provided cover for about 10 CIA operatives between 1950 and 1966. He does not know who they are, who they were, or who in the newspaper's management made the arrangements. In the field, journalists were used to help recruit and handle foreigners as agents, to acquire and evaluate information, and to plant false information with officials of foreign governments. From the agency's perspective, there is nothing untoward in such relationships, and any ethical questions are a matter for the journalistic profession to solve, not the intelligence community. Fancy that. So in other words, it's not the government's job, it's the newspaper's job. If they want to cuddle up to us and we give them free money, I mean, that's fine. Oh boy. During the 1976 investigation of the CIA by the Senate Intelligence Committee, chaired by Senator Frank Church, the dimensions of the agency's involvement with the press became apparent to several members of the panel, as well as 2 or 3 investigators on the staff. The top officials of the CIA, including former directors William Colby and George Bush Sr., yeah, the guy who became president, persuaded the committee to restrict its inquiry into the matter and to deliberately misrepresent the actual scope of the activities in its final report. The multi-volume report contains 9 pages in which the use of journalists is discussed in deliberately vague and sometimes misleading terms. It makes no mention of the actual number of journalists who undertook covert tasks for the CIA, nor does it adequately describe the role played by the newspaper and broadcast executives in cooperating with the agency. The agency's dealings with the press began during the earliest stages of the Cold War. Allen Dulles, who became director of the CIA in 1953, sought to establish a recruiting and cover capability within America's most prestigious journalistic institutions. By operating under the guise of accredited news correspondents, Dulles believed CIA operatives abroad would be accorded a degree of access and freedom of movement unobtainable under almost any other type of cover. American publishers, like so many other corporate and institutional leaders at the time, were willing to commit the resources of their companies to the struggle against global communism. Accordingly, the traditional line separating the American press corps and the government was often indistinguishable. Rarely was a news agency used to provide cover for CIA operatives abroad without the knowledge and consent of either its principal owner, publisher, or senior editor. Thus, contrary to the notion that the CIA insidiously infiltrated the journalistic community, there is ample evidence that America's leading publishers and news executives allowed themselves and their organizations to become handmaidens to the intelligence services. "Let's not pick on some poor reporters, for God's sake," William Colby exclaimed at one point to the Church Committee's investigators. "Let's go to the managements." They were writing, in all, about 25 news organizations, including those listed at the beginning of this article, provided cover for the agency. Gotta love it. Let's see. It goes on. Not too much more. The CIA even ran a formal training program in the 1950s to teach its agents to be journalists. Intelligence officers were taught to make noises like reporters, explained a high CIA official, and were then placed in major news organizations with the help from management. These were the guys who went through the ranks and were told, "You're going to be a journalist," the CIA official said. Relatively few of the 400-some relationships described in agency files followed that pattern. However, most involved persons who are already bona fide journalists when they began undertaking tasks for the agency. The agency's relationships with journalists, as described in CIA files, include the following general categories. Category 1, legitimate. Accredited staff members of news organizations, usually reporters. Some were paid, some worked for the agency on a purely voluntary basis. This group includes many of the best-known journalists who carried out tasks for the CIA. The files show that the salaries paid to reporters by newspaper and broadcast networks were sometimes supplemented by nominal payments from the CIA, either in form of retainers, travel expenses, or outlays for specific services performed. Almost all the payments were made in cash. The accredited category also includes photographers, administrative personnel of foreign news bureaus, and members of broadcast technical crews. So the taxpayers paid in cash for the CIA to snuggle up with the media. If that's not fascist, I don't know what is. Pressing on. Employees of so-called CIA proprietaries. During the past 25 years, the agency has secretly bankrolled numerous foreign press services, periodicals, and newspapers, both English and foreign language, which provided excellent cover for CIA operatives. One such publication was the Rome Daily American, 40% of which was owned by the CIA until the 1970s. The Daily American went out of business this year, which I think was 77 when this article was written, so... The taxpayers owned almost half, so basically half of this business was owned and funded by the CIA and spit out propaganda and then went out of business. That isn't a waste. That's a waste. Oh boy, let's see. Editors, publishers, broadcast network executives. The CIA's relationship with most news executives differed fundamentally from those with working reporters and stringers who were more subject to direction from the agency. Names a couple names. There were columnists and commentators. There are perhaps a dozen well-known columnists and broadcast commentators whose relationships with the CIA go far beyond those normally maintained between reporters and their sources. They are referred to at the agency as known assets and can be counted on to perform a variety of undercover tasks. They are considered receptive to the agency's point of view on various subjects. Three of the most widely read columnists who maintain such ties with the agency are C.L. Sulzberger of the New York Times, Joseph Alsop, the late Stuart Alsop, whose column appeared in the New York Herald Tribune, the Saturday Evening Post, and Newsweek. Let's see. Murky details of the CIA's relationships with individuals and news organizations began trickling out in 1973 when it was first disclosed that the CIA had, on occasion, employed journalists. These reports, combined with new information, serve as casebook studies of the agency's use of journalists for intelligent purposes. They include the New York Times. Hey. The agency's relationship with the Times was by far its most valuable among newspapers, according to CIA officials. From 1950 to 1966, about 10 CIA employees were provided Times cover under arrangements approved by the newspaper's late publisher, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger. The cover arrangements were part of a general Times policy set by Sulzberger to provide assistance to the CIA whenever possible. Sulzberger was especially close to Allen Dulles. At that level of contact, it was the mighty talking to the mighty, said a high-level CIA official who was present at some of the discussions. There was an agreement in principle that, yes, indeed, we would help each other. The question of cover came up on several occasions. It was agreed that the actual arrangements would be handled by subordinates. The mighty didn't want to know the specifics. They wanted plausible deniability. CIA officials cited two reasons why the agency's working relationship with the Times was closer and more extensive than with any other paper: the fact that the Times maintained the largest foreign news operation in American daily journalism, and the close personal ties between the men who ran both institutions. Yada, yada, yada. The Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS. CBS was unquestionably the CIA's most valuable broadcasting asset. CBS President William Paley and Allen Dulles enjoyed an easy working and social relationship. Over the years, the network provided cover for CIA employees, including at least one well-known foreign correspondent and several stringers. It supplied outtakes of news film to the CIA, established a formal channel of communication between the Washington bureau chief and the agency, gave the agency access to the CBS news film library, and allowed reports by CBS correspondents to the Washington and New York newsrooms to be routinely monitored by the CIA. Once a year during the 1950s and early 1960s, CBS correspondents joined the CIA hierarchy for private dinners and briefings. But wait, there's more. Time and Newsweek magazines. According to CIA and Senate sources, agency files contain written agreements with former foreign correspondents and stringers for both the weekly news magazines. The same sources refuse to say whether the CIA has ended all its associations with individuals who work for the two publications. Allen Dulles often interceded with his good friend, the late Henry Luce, founder of Time and Life magazines, who readily allowed certain members of his staff to work for the agency and agreed to provide jobs and credentials for other CIA operatives who lacked journalistic experience. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Time magazine's foreign correspondents attended CIA briefing dinners similar to those the CIA held for CBS. And Luce, according to CIA officials, made it a regular practice to brief Dulles. Dulles or Dulles? I don't know. Oh, whatever. Dulles. We'll just say Dulles. Or other high agency officials, blah, blah, blah. Let me back up. Made it a regular practice to brief Dulles or other high agency officials when he returned from his frequent trips abroad. Luce and the men who ran his magazines in the 1950s and 1960s encouraged their foreign correspondents to provide help to the CIA, particularly information that might be useful to the agency for intelligence purposes or recruiting foreigners. At Newsweek, agency sources reported the CIA engaged the services of several foreign correspondents and stringers under arrangements approved by senior editors at the magazine. Newsweek's stringer in Rome in the mid-50s made little secret of the fact that he worked for the CIA. Malcolm Muir, Newsweek's editor from its founding in 1937, that was a long time ago, until its sale to the Washington Post Company in 1961, said in a recent interview that his dealings with the CIA were limited to private briefings he gave Allen Dulles after trips abroad and arrangements he approved for regular debriefing of Newsweek correspondence by the agency. He said that he had never provided cover for CIA operatives, but that others high in the Newsweek organization might have done so without his knowledge. In 1965 to 66, an accredited Newsweek stringer in the Far East was in fact a CIA contract employee earning an annual salary of $10,000 from the agency, according to Robert T. Wood, then a CIA officer in the Hong Kong station. Some Newsweek correspondents and stringers continued to maintain covert ties with the agency into the 1970s, CIA sources said. There we go. The American Broadcasting Company, ABC, and the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, according to CIA officials, ABC continued to provide cover for some CIA operatives through the 1960s. One was Sam Jeff, who CIA officials said performed clandestine tasks for the agency. Jeff has acknowledged only providing the CIA with information. In addition, another well-known network correspondent performed covert tasks for the agency, said CIA sources. At the time of the Senate hearings, agency officials serving at the highest levels refused to say whether the CIA was still maintaining active relationships with members of the ABC News organization. All cover arrangements were made with the knowledge of ABC executives, the sources said. Blah, blah, blah. Other major news organizations, according to agency officials, CIA files documented additional cover arrangements with the following news gathering organizations. Among others, the New York Herald Tribune, Saturday Evening Post, Scripps Howard newspapers, Hearst newspapers, Seymour K. Frieden, haven't heard that one, Hearst's current London bureau chief and a former Herald Tribune editor and correspondent, has been identified as a CIA operative by agency sources. Associated Press, United Press International, the Mutual Broadcasting System, Reuters, and the Miami Herald. Cover arrangements with the Herald, according to CIA officials, were unusual in that they were made on the ground by the CIA station in Miami and not from CIA headquarters. And that's just a small part of the list, in the words of one official who served in the CIA hierarchy. Like many sources, this official said that the only way to end the uncertainties about aid furnished by the agency to journalists is to disclose the contents of the CIA files, a course opposed by almost all of the 35 present and former CIA officials interviewed over the course of a year. We can't have our dirty laundry coming out now, can we? Let's see. The CIA's use of journalists continued virtually unabated until 1973, when, in response to public disclosure that the agency had secretly employed American reporters, William Colby began scaling down the program. In his public statements, Colby conveyed the impression that the use of journalists had been minimal and of limited importance to the agency. Of course, they just kept doing it for decades and paid out lots of money and ran a front company because it was of limited importance. I mean, you know, it wasn't that important, right? After Colby left the agency on January 28th, 1976, and was succeeded by George Bush, yes, that Bush, once again, guy ran for president, used to work for the CIA. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? CIA announced a new policy. Effective immediately, the CIA will not enter into any paid or contractual relationship with any full-time or part-time news correspondent accredited by any U.S. news service, newspaper, periodical, radio or television network or station. At the time of the announcement, the agency acknowledged that the policy would result in termination of less than half of the relationships with the 50 U.S. journalists it said were still affiliated with the agency. The text of the announcement noted that the CIA would continue to welcome the voluntary, unpaid cooperation of journalists. Thus, many relationships were permitted to remain intact. The agency's unwillingness to end its use of journalists and its continued relationships with some news executives is largely the product of two basic facts of the intelligence game. Journalistic cover is ideal because of the inquisitive nature of a reporter's job, and many other sources of institutional cover have been denied the CIA in recent years by businesses, foundations, and educational institutions that once cooperated with the agency. Despite the evidence of widespread CIA use of journalists, the Senate Intelligence Committee and its staff decided against the questioning of any of the reporters, editors, publishers, or broadcast executives whose relationships with the agency are detailed in CIA files. The Senate Intelligence Committee. Thanks, guys. Senate Committee's investigation into the use of journalists was supervised by William B. Bader? I'm just going to say Bader. A former CIA intelligence officer who returned briefly to the agency this year as deputy to CIA Director Stansfield Turner and is now a high-level intelligence official at the Defense Department. Bader was assisted by David Aaron, who now serves as the deputy to, I can never say this guy's name, Brzezinski, that guy, President Carter's national security advisor. According to colleagues on the staff of the Senate inquiry, both Bader and Aaron were disturbed by the information contained in the CIA files about journalists. They urged that further investigation be undertaken by the Senate's new Permanent CIA Oversight Committee That committee, however, has spent its first year of existence writing a new charter for the CIA, and members say there has been little interest in delving further into the CIA's use of the press. Yada, yada, yada. There is quite an incredible spread of relationships, Bader reported to the senators. You don't need to manipulate Time magazine, for example, because there are agency people at the management level. Oh, there we go. Let's see. Obscuring the facts was relatively simple. No mention was made of the 400 summaries or what they showed. Instead, the report noted blandly that some 50 recent contacts with journalists had been studied by the committee staff, thus conveying the impression that the agencies dealing with the press had been limited to those instances. The agency files, the report noted, contained little evidence that the editorial content of the American news reports had been affected by the CIA's dealings with journalists. Colby's misleading public statements about the use of journalists were repeated without serious contradiction or elaboration. The role of cooperating news executives was given short shrift. The fact that the agency had concentrated its relationships in the most prominent sectors of the press went unmentioned. That the CIA continued to regard the press as up for grabs was not even suggested. Whew. Well, that was a long one, but we got through it. I hope you got something out of that. I know it was long, but the government does some shady things sometimes. Well, oftentimes. And they've been snuggling up to the media. Well, they had been snuggling up to the media. And I'm sure they're doing other things this very moment. But if there's one thing I'd like to do tonight, I'd like to leave you with a question. And that's, what makes you think they ever stopped the CIA and the news and all that? Supposedly George Bush ended the paid relationships, but as you can see, voluntary relationships were most welcome. And these agencies, both news and government, have relationships stretching back decades. And by now, they're probably long-established relationships. They probably still attend dinners and fundraisers and all sorts of things together. So, who's to say that the media isn't under certain influences these days? Anyway, that's about it. I hope you have a good night. I hope everything's well with you, especially during these times. It's rough out there. I just hope everybody stays safe, and I hope we get this economy running back up again, given the thing that's going on. And yeah, I hope the best for you all. And I hope you have a good weekend. I really do. Get some rest, recuperate, get those things done, mow the lawn, do the laundry. Yeah, that's how it is, right? Exciting. Or you can just stay home and play video games all day. I mean, why not? Laundry doesn't need to get done, right? I mean, I wish. Anyway, good night, everyone.